Hello and welcome to this short .NET Core Jumpstart tutorial about the .NET Core Web API. So lately a student of mine asked me if I could create a new video about how to build a pretty basic web API with .NET Core, and that's what we're going to do today. So Mike, here you are, this is the video, and just to clarify, we are really going to build a basic version, a walking skeleton, as you would like to say, of .NET Core Web API with .NET Core version 2.2, and we won't implement any fancy stuff, so we leave out the asynchronous stuff. We won't use HTTPS. We will not connect our web service to a database. We will use some mock data to send data back and forth between client and service, but in essence, this is everything you will need to make your web API work. So let's start by opening the terminal, and we create a new web API with .NET, new web API. Okay, and now as you already can see, we have some folders here, like the controllers folder. This one is important. We have the example implementation for the values controller, where we could already get these values here, the string array for the values, and also a single value with this get method. Then Visual Studio Code is asking us to add some more assets which are required here, and yes, of course we want to add them, and this was simply this VS Code folder right here with the launch JSON and the tasks JSON. For now, not very important for us. The only thing that might be a bit more interesting is the launch settings JSON with the application URL for the HTTPS URL and the regular HTTP URL, and here you can change the port where this thing is running. Apart from that, I won't go that deep into the other files because this really should be short, and I only want to change the files that are really important for us. So again, we have the controller here, and we will build a controller by ourselves too. Then we have the program.cs file. This is the start of our file, and then the startup CS. And in the startup CS, we will have to add some configs, some configurations, for instance, regarding the dependency injection, or also the CORS issue we would have if you would like to start the service or access the service, communicate with it from any kind of client application. For instance, an Angular web application you have created, then this application would run usually on port 4200, and when you then want to access this web service which is running on port 5000, this wouldn't work, so you have to configure CORS, but we'll get to that. Now first, for the general structure, what I like to do is create a new folder for our models. These are the classes that we send back and forth, and just to mention, usually in another project, in a project that will be used in the real world, you can add some so-called DTOs, which will be data transfer objects, and also to send them back in a response, you would also create, let's say, a wrapper object to put this data into this wrapper object, and also add some kind of message to it, because maybe you need the message to give the user more feedback, to launch a toaster with a success message, or launch a toaster with an error message if something went wrong. But for now, we just want to add a model, and also we need a folder for our services, and we will create only one service and one model in this short tutorial. And what I would like to do is, just for this example, add a calendar entry. So in the models folder, I right click and create a new C# class, and this will be the calendar entry. And by the way, this right click and or to have this available, this new C# class, new C# interface and so on, you need an extension for that, and this extension is called C# extensions. This one right here. If I make this a little bigger, you see the icon. That's the extension I'm talking about. Okay, now let's go back to the calendar entry file. So here, quite simple. I don't add any ID or anything like that, and I always use the built-in snippets of Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. So this means you can just enter prop for property, hit tab, and then we have a new property, and now I can say I want to use the date time type and use this for the date. We don't have the reference for date time, so what I do is we can either press the light bulb here and click using system, or if you want to stick to the keyboard, you just press Control and point, and then you have all the suggestions right here, and we will use the system reference. And also the second one would be a string with a title. That's it. This is what I want to use for the model. Again, if you would do this in a real-world application, we would also add something like datetime, date created, and store this in the database. Maybe also date updated, the user that has created this entry, and so on. And then you would create another class that would be the data transfer object, the DTO, to just send the information to the client that you really need, and don't provide any other internal stuff or any other meta information you have stored in the database. So we have our model with the date and the title. And next would be to create the service for this thing. So we create another folder in the services folder, and this thing is called calendar entry service, because I like to have my things organized a little bit at least. And now here we create new files. The first one is the C# interface with a capital I, and then the calendar entry service. So just to recap, well, it's preferable that you have already some knowledge of C#, because if not, that would be overwhelming and maybe also a little bit intimidating. But still, we have our interface. This is some kind of contract, because if we then create our implementation of the interface, so a new C# class, calendar entry service, we want to use this interface. And now when we implement this interface here, this simply means that we have to implement the methods that are written here in this interface. Now for this example, let's start with a get method. So something like, I want to have a list of calendar entries. This is the return type, a list that consists of calendar entries, and we simply call this get calendar entries with no parameter, no arguments, nothing. And of course, Visual Studio is not recognizing what's happening here. What are these types? So we're using a list. For that we need the system collections generic reference and also our calendar service models for the calendar entry. I save this, and now you can already see there's an error in the calendar entry service. That's because we don't implement the new method we have written in the interface. And again, what we can do here, simply hit Control Point or use the light bulb to easily implement the interface. Okay, now we have the method right here. But for now, it just throws a system not implemented exception. Not really helpful for us, but still we can continue implementing the body of this method. And what I want to do, since I don't want to connect this thing to a database, I just send some mock data to the client, and this mock data will be a list of calendar entries. And this is already initialized as a new list of calendar entries, like that. And when we get a new entry, what I would like to do is simply add a new mock entry, a new dummy calendar entry to this list, and then send the list back, just to see how this stuff works. So let's say we have a calendar entry, new entry, like that, and this new entry gets a date, which is date time now, and we have a title like my new project, something like that. And then we add this entry to the list of entries, and in the end we simply return entries. That's already it. So again, short recap. In the interface iCalendar entry service, we created this new method here, get calendar entries, where the return type is a list of calendar entries with no parameter, no argument whatsoever, the most basic form we can use. And then in the implementation of the calendar entry service, we created a dummy list, a private variable entries, and then implemented the get calendar entries method from the interface. And here we create a new entry, add it to the list, and then send the list back. So the model and the service in the most basic form is implemented, and what we now need to do is add a new controller, because the controller will be the access point or the endpoint, when you want to call it that way, where any client can communicate with our service. So let's create a new controller. Right-click the controllers folder, new C# class, and call this thing calendar entry controller. All right. Now we have to add some stuff before we implement the controller. First thing is we want to use the controller base class, and already we can add the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC reference. That's just the reference we need for the controller base. And if you want to dig a little bit deeper and want to see what's going on there, you can just hit F12 on your keyboard, and Visual Studio Code is looking for the implementation of this class. And as you can see, this is an abstract class, controller base, and you can read through this whole documentation and see what's going on here. But again, that would be too much for this short tutorial. Apart from that, to make this thing work, we need the API controller attribute, and also we have to add a route for this thing. And this is actually the route or the URL where you can access this controller. And this route is typically API / and then in brackets controller, and this thing right here, brackets then controller, is a convention That just means that you can access this controller with API and then the name of the controller. In our case, the name is calendar entry. So the class name without the controller part. So API calendar entry would be the route for our controller. All right, then next would be to implement the constructor of this controller, because with the constructor we will use the so-called dependency injection, and there we will inject our implemented calendar entry service. But let's just do this. So we have the constructor with, we can also use a built-in snippet, CTOR, hit tab, and then we already see a public method, which is the constructor. The class name is simply calendar entry controller, and parameters. Now the parameters. So what we want to use again here is the calendar entry service. So to inject this service, what we have to do is simply call the type, use the type calendar entry service. Make sure that you use the interface, so the calendar entry service. Call this thing calendar entry service. We add our reference, control point, and then what we can do is, again with control and point, we can initialize this field from parameter. Now what's this thing doing? Let me just close this here. We have a new private read-only variable. What I like to do is call these private read-only variables with underscore. So just put the underscore in front of the name. And this will be then our instance of the calendar entry service that we can access with every other method we are creating here. So again, a constructor where we inject the calendar entry service and set the private read-only variable that we have available in the controller with this injected service. Okay, and now the last thing we actually need is to implement a method that is used by any client. So we have a public method. Now the return type will be an iAction result. This is something that will send back a HTTP response with a HTTP status code like 200, 400, 500, whatever you may already have seen. And that's why we need an iAction result. So let's use the iAction result type and call this method also get calendar entries. So get calendar entries, and now we want to get a result we can send to the client, and this result will be the actual list of our calendar entries. So ilist calendar entry. And of course we have again to add the references, all the usings. Let's call this result. And this then will be the method we have implemented in the calendar service. So calendar entry service, get calendar entries. And now we have our entries, and in the end we simply have to return this stuff, and we can return it with an OK, and then put the result into this. And when you want to see what this OK actually means, then you can, of course, with F12 dig a little bit deeper, and as you can see here, this is an OK object result, or here an OK result, and this thing creates an OK object result that produces and returns an HTTP status code of status 200 OK. So we could also use this class here, or even go deeper and use an object result, go even deeper to look what this thing is doing, and so on. I think you get the idea. We can use several status codes, several types or methods to return the result. For instance, we could also say we haven't found anything, and then we will send something back with the status code 404. But in our case, we have a list of calendar entries, and that's why we send the result back with the status code 200. Okay, let's save everything. And short recap, we created the model, the service, and now also the controller. Important was to use the controller base class. We added the API controller attribute and also the route. Then we added the constructor and injected the calendar service, and have the calendar service now available as a private variable right here. And then in the get calendar entries method, we used the calendar entry service to get the calendar entries. Now, one minor thing we can add to make things more clear, since this is the access point for our clients, we can tell the controller with this attribute that this will be a get method, meaning that we have to use the HTTP get method, the HTTP method get, to get access to this method. But in essence, usually this web API, this web service would know when your method is called get anything. So for instance, get calendar entries, then with this get, the web service will see that, or assume that this is a get method, and you wouldn't have to add this attribute. But anyways, for instance, we could also say, okay, now this is a post, although this wouldn't make any sense right here, but still, that way things are maybe a bit clearer. Alright, now we are not done yet, but still what I want to do is already use Postman to try to access this service. But first, of course, we have to run this thing, and to do that we can just use .NET watch run. We could also just use .NET run, but if you didn't know, with the watch part here, we just tell the application that if a file changes, like when I just press Ctrl S to save this file, it recognizes the change or the saving process, and then recompiles and restarts the web service. And as you can see right here, it is now listening on port 5000, so the URL would be HTTP localhost 5000. And now when I go to Postman, I already have some calls here, but this is a brand new one, so you see how to do this from scratch. First we have to add a header, which would be the content type, and this thing is application JSON. We can enter the HTTP method right here, everything we need, but this is a get method, and here we add HTTP /localhost port 5000, and then API calendar entry, hit save, hit send, and then we get an error back, a 500 internal server error. And this is the nice thing. Now in this environment we see the exact error, which is unable to resolve the service for type iCalendar entry service. Also, we don't only see the error right here, we also see it in Visual Studio right here. It's telling us exactly the same thing. So what does this mean? This simply means that we try to inject the iCalendar entry service, but the Web API does not know which implementation it should use for the iCalendar entry service interface. So we have to tell him, and we do that right here. So in the configure services method in the startup CS, not JS. So we just add services and then add scoped, and then we tell him in these brackets. So if you're using the iCalendar entry service, then please use the implementation of the calendar entry service, and that's it. And this is the, by the way, the nice thing of dependency injection, or one of the nice things, that we can tell the application with this single line, if you see the iCalendar entry service interface and someone wants you to use the iCalendar entry service, like in the calendar entry controller, we just tell the application then use this implementation right here. If somebody in your team then wants, or yourself, you want to change the implementation, but you don't want to change this class, you could, for instance, create a new class called calendar entry service version 2. Then you could absolutely do that, and you don't have to change also the interface and go to the controllers and change the interface there. You could simply say, okay, I created this class now, and I just changed this little line, and the controllers would know which implementation they should use, and the thing is done. You have a new implementation of your class. But anyways, this is how we tell our Web API to use, and in particular our calendar entry controller, that it should use the calendar entry service implementation. And now it should be restarted. Perfect. So we go back to Postman, send, and there we have it. This is our result. And let's have a look at the pretty version. This is, as you can see with the brackets here, this is the array, the list we sent back to the client with the date, quite early, 6:23 a.m. and the title, my new project. Okay, this is the get method. And now let's implement another example for a post method. So let's go to the interface, and what I want to do is we send a calendar entry to this web service, add this entry to the entry list, and send the whole list back, just so we see that everything works, so the communication works between client and service. So again, we send back an iList with calendar entries. This is our return type, and now we call this method create calendar entry, and this time we need a parameter which is simply a new calendar entry. So again, return type iList consists of calendar entries, method is called create calendar entry, and we have the argument calendar entry of type calendar entry, and it's called entry. So many entries. Okay. Then the method. Or you don't have to type this thing, you can simply use implement interface. There we have our method. And regarding the implementation, quite short actually, we take the entries list and add the new entry. Again, that's really short, no error handling, nothing like that. And then simply return entries. That's it. This is the whole thing. So we're getting an entry from the client, add it to the entries list, and return the whole list. Okay, and then for the controller part, again, we have a public method with an iAction result. And by the way, if you're interested, when you would do that asynchronously, you would have something like task of iAction result, and also this would be an async method. But this is just a sneak peek if you would add asynchronous functionality to your web service. But for now, public iAction result, create calendar entry, and we're getting an entry from the client, and the result would be again a list of calendar entries, and we call the service with create calendar entry, give this method the entry we got from the client, and return OK result. And last thing would be to add the HTTP method with HTTP post. All right, that's it. So we save everything. By the way, I save everything with Control K and then S, not Control K and Control S. It's Control K then S. Took me some time to learn that. Okay, so we have all our methods, and now when we go to Postman, we can actually just copy this thing right here, then say post, and in the body raw, that's what I was looking for, we have to hit raw. We just add this object, and we can also remove this thing and maybe say, okay, it's Christmas. Wait, first the month, like that. Christmas, and send this thing, and you see this is our result. With the brackets, you see again that this is the actual entry list or array, and we get the object back from the service, and it also added the time to the date. All right, and that's already it. We have the basic web service. Again, we didn't implement asynchronous calls, we did not use DTOs, we have not connected to a database, but this is the basic walking skeleton. And just one more thing, if you want to use an Angular client, for instance, or any other client, doesn't matter if you use React, Vue, or even plain JavaScript or jQuery, you would have to add CORS, and this can be done with services add CORS, and then you also have to configure this with app use CORS. And for a development version of your application, it's totally sufficient to just allow everything. So this takes a lambda expression, and we say allow any method, allow any origin, and also allow any header. In our case now with Postman, wouldn't change anything, but if you're going to use a client and want to access the methods from the browser, then you would have to do it that way. But as you can see, this is still working. as before. All right, that's it. This is our basic web API. I hope this was helpful for you. If so, I would really appreciate it if you click the like button and subscribe to this channel, of course. And if you're looking for some online coaching, online tutoring, or any online courses about all this stuff and Angular and other web development topics, send me an email or check out the links in the description below. Maybe we'll find a solution for you. So thanks for watching and take care.